Genesis chapter 2, and we're going to look at verses 15 to 17. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to dress and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. So here we find back at the beginning of the world, at the beginning of creation, just as God was creating humanity, he also put into place a simple test of loyalty. Told Adam, the garden is full of trees that are full of fruit, and you can eat from any of them except for that one right over there. I think a lot of people probably speculate through years, what was it about this tree of knowledge of good and evil? I mean, did it, was the fruit, he was told when you eat of it, you're going to die. So does that mean the fruit was poisonous? I don't know for sure, but I think that if we had access to that tree today and we took some of that fruit and we chemically analyzed it, put it through a mass spectrometer and all the different tests, it would test just like the fruit of any of the other trees around it. I don't think there was anything chemically different about that tree. What made that tree different is that God set it apart. He said, the others are yours to use as you want, but this tree is mine. Don't touch it. Don't use it. Leave it alone. Don't eat from that tree. That's my tree. It belongs to me. And so this put in place a simple test of loyalty, of whether humanity would remain loyal to God or not. I ask, why did God even do something like that? Well, that the Bible tells us that God is love. And so he created us to be able to be in a relationship with him, a loving relationship. And the thing about love is love must be freely given. If it's forced, it's not love. And so God, if he was going to create beings who could choose to love him, they had to be free to choose to not love him. And so there had to be an opportunity for them to make a choice between loving him or loving self, obeying him or not, or disobeying him, being loyal or disloyal. And so God put this simple test into place to give humanity an opportunity of whether they would freely choose to be in a relationship with him or they wouldn't. And of course we know that they failed that test. They chose disloyalty to God. And we live in what goes on in this world as a result of the sin that came into this world at that time. And so we find at the beginning of the world then there was a test of loyalty to give people an opportunity to express their relationship with God, whether they loved him or not. So God created us as free moral agents with the power to choose. And then he had to give them an opportunity to exercise that choice. Now let's go to the opposite end of the Bible. Let's go to the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 14. Revelation 14, verse 7. Saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. So here in this verse, it points out that we're called upon to worship the Creator. If we go back and look at chapters 13 and 14, let's look at several verses through 13 here, and we'll see this word worship is a recurring theme in this section of Revelation. So let's go to Revelation 13, verse 4. And they worshiped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And then down to verse 8. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Verse 12. And he exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and caused the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Verse 15. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that is, image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many who would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And then to chapter 14, verse 9. And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast in his image and receive his mark in his forehead and his hand. So we find here a number of references to the word worship. And all but one are referring to worshiping the beast powers, the dragon, the beast, or the image to the beast. But right in the middle of all of these is this call to worship the Creator. So we find then that the test at the end of time has to do with who do you worship? Do you worship the beast powers? Or do you worship the Lord? Do you worship the Creator? And so worship is going to be a part of the main conflict at the end of time in this world. Another theme that we find in this section here, if we go to Revelation 12, verse 17, Revelation 12:17 says, the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So here it talks about the remnant, or the last portion of the woman of God's church upon earth, are designated as being those who keep the commandments of God. And then if we go to chapter 14, verse 12, here's the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So again, in this setting of the end time and the final warnings, it mentions that God's end time saints are those that keep the commandments of God. So we have to deal with worship, and we have to deal with the commandments, or issues at the end of time. So what is worship? Worship has to do with our relationship with God. Which commandments specifically deal with our relationship with God? First four. To not have any other gods before you, not to have any graven images, not take the Lord's name in vain, and the Sabbath commandment. So those four have to do with our relationship with God, or worship. So we should expect that these, the commandments in general, but especially the first four commandments, become a point of conflict at the end of time. And so we said the first commandment is to not have any other gods before me. Well, in this section of Revelation 12 through 14, we find there's a dragon, and then there's a beast from the seed, which is usually just called the beast, and there's a second beast which comes up to the land, and later in Revelation is referred to as the false prophet. And we see these three kind of functioning together. In fact, later in Revelation we find them sort of, all working together at the same time. And it talks about the three unclean spirits coming out from them and going and gathering the world together at the Battle of Armageddon. So these three are sort of, interesting. You find that the dragon gives authority and stuff to the beast power. The beast power suffers a deadly wound and then lives. And then the false prophet, he points everyone back to the beast. Now, does that sound like anything else that we might be familiar with in the Bible? How about the Godhead, the Trinity? The Father gives the authority to the Son. The Son suffered a deadly wound. He died and resurrected. The Holy Spirit doesn't testify of himself, but points to Jesus. And so what we have here is a false or anti-Christian Trinity at the end of time. So there we find assault on the first command. These powers receive worship. So there are other gods before me. So there's an assault on the first commandment. Revelation 13:1, describing the beast, the second one of that anti-Christian Trinity, says, I stood up on the sand of the sea, saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And so we find that he's described as being a blasphemous, I skipped ahead here. I skipped a command. Second commandment is to no graven images. And so what do we find? The false prophet makes a image to the beast. And then we find that the beast power is a blasphemous power, not to take the Lord's name in vain. Well, he's described as being a blasphemous power. Blasphemy is making claims that one has authority from God and one doesn't, and similar things, the ability to forgive sins, and so on. And so that we find the first 3 of those 4 commandments specifically being challenged here by the beast powers. And so we would expect then that the 4th one would be as well. And it's interesting that call that we looked at in Revelation 14:7, that call to worship the Creator, the language in that comes right from the 4th commandment. And so the call to worship the Creator is given in the language of the fourth commandment, which we find in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, and we'll begin with the 8th verse. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day, wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So there we find the language there where it talks about how that in 6 days the Lord made heaven, earth, and sea. That language is the exact same that we find in Revelation 14:7. So, this issue over who do you worship is given the context of the first 4 commandments, and the specific language of the call to worship the Creator is given the language of the 4th commandment. So we find that the final issue in this world is really similar to the one at the beginning of this world. Who do you worship? Who are you going to obey? Who are you going to be loyal to? And so we see there's going to be a test of loyalty at the end of this world, just as there was at the beginning of this world. And by quoting from the 4th commandment, John is pointing us back to one of the central issues is going to be over the Sabbath. Which day do you keep as the Sabbath? And we will see, that the Bible is explicit here in Exodus chapter 20, that it's the 7th day is the Sabbath. God, wrote in the 10 Commandments his own fingers on tables of stone, and so that that we can expect this is going to be an issue as we push to the end of time. We've seen times in the past, in history, when this issue has kind of come up, that there have been Sunday laws where you weren't allowed to do this or that on Sunday, and that even before that you had to go to church on Sunday. George Washington one time was traveling, I believe it was through Connecticut, on a Sunday, and there was one of the positions in the colonial government, or the government, was called the tithesman. Part of his job was to go make sure everyone was in church. And the penalties are, well, the first time you got fined, and the second time you might go to jail. And in fact, in Virginia, the penalty for the 3rd time was that you could be put to death. Now, there's no evidence that was ever carried out, but it was a law on the books. And so we can see in the past this issue of conflict over, are you going to worship on Sunday, or are you going to worship on the biblical Sabbath, have come to heads. We can expect, based on what the Revelation tells us, that this issue is going to come to the forefront again at the end of time. Now, does that mean that everyone goes to church on Sunday right now is lost? No. Because we see that this is a specific issue at the end of time. We can expect, as it's agitated, as it's promoted, as laws come out, people are going to become aware of it. Then they're going to have to make a decision. There are many people today that don't, they're following the Lord with all the light that they have, and with all their heart, and as far as they understand, they should be going to church on Sunday, and that's what they do. Doesn't mean that they're lost. Doesn't mean that just because you're going to church on Saturday, that doesn't mean you're saved either. We're not saved because we keep one day or the other. But what does it do? It's an outward manifestation of if our heart is right with the Lord at that time. I say today there are people that don't understand, and so as far as they're following the Lord as far as they see. But there's going to come a time when everyone's going to see, and then those who truly follow the Lord are going to make one decision, and those who aren't really following the Lord, they're going to make a different decision. But we understand that the Sabbath day is going to be an issue. And we need to understand also that it's more than which day we go to church on. Sometimes we kind of just talk in short forms. We kind of talk, well, you go to church on Saturday or you go to church on Sunday. But really what day you go to church on isn't the issue. Keeping the Sabbath is so much more than about going to church. Now, is going to church a part of it? Yes, the Bible tells us the Sabbath is meant to be a holy convocation. That's a holy gathering. Was to occur on the Sabbath. That's true. But it's more than just that. as we've already read here in the fourth commandment in Exodus, it tells us that they were not to do work on the Sabbath day. And so it was more than just going to church. It was, you weren't supposed to do any work on this particular day. So the Sabbath is a 24-hour period. The Bible tells us that we are to keep thy Sabbath from even unto even, from evening or from sundown to sundown you shall keep your Sabbath. So in other words, from sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night, that whole 24-hour period is God's seventh-day Sabbath. And so that's a time we're meant to set aside. And so God grants us this test of loyalty. And I think, just as to look at the tree of knowledge of good and evil, I don't think you can see anything different about it from the other trees. It's just that God designated it. Now of course you can't chemically analyze time, but if we were to look at the time of the Sabbath in some way versus the time in any other day, there's 24 hours in the Sabbath like there are any other day. There's 60 minutes in each hour and 60 seconds in each minute and so on. The sun still comes up and goes down, and nature doesn't just freeze frame or something like that. So, many of the other Ten Commandments, they certainly have a certain logic behind them. Especially the ones, the last six, those are pretty obvious. I don't kill people because I don't want to be killed. I don't steal from people I don't want to be stolen from, and so on. So there's a certain logic of why those should be in place. And if there is a God to give these laws, well then why would I want to worship anybody else? And if he's asked not to, he's it says that the Bible tells us that God is a spirit, in the sense that he's not a physical being. Well, why should I make a physical image of him? And, I should keep his name reverent. But the Sabbath day, why this particular period? Well, the only reason is God says so. So that's why it functions as a test of loyalty, much like the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So that's why we see it in place in the book of Revelation. So as those who have been called out to keep and to proclaim God's Sabbath, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? Again, we've already said it, it's more than just going to church, although that, again, as we said, that's an important part of it. But what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? So it says we shouldn't labor, we shouldn't do any work on the Sabbath. The fourth commandment tells us in Exodus 20, verse 10. What does it mean to work? That's always been a challenging, one that some have tried to, debate, and some trying to come up with an excuse to do anything that they want, and some coming down on the other extreme of trying to, we're just going to lock everything down tight so we don't make any mistakes. That was kind of the Jewish answer. We'll look at that more in just a little bit. But let's go ahead and look now at Exodus chapter 16. Exodus 16, beginning with verse 22. And it came to pass that on the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man, and the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said to them, This is that which the Lord hath said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which ye will bake today, seethe that which ye will seethe, and that which ye remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. And they laid up till the morning as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm in it. Worm therein. And Moses said, Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord, for today ye shall not find it in the field. 6 days ye shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. And it came to pass, there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said unto Moses, How long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? For see that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath, therefore he giveth you on the sixth day the bread of 2 days. Abide ye every man in his place, let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. This is talking about when God gave the manna, the bread that fell from heaven. Now most days they were told to, you gather enough for today. And you go out in the morning, and you had to get up early to go get it, because when the sun was fully risen, it kind of melted away to nothing. So, there were some bright who thought, if I get twice as much today, I can sleep in tomorrow. They had a rude surprise when they got up the next morning, because if they tried to keep any over, it was full of maggots and stinky. And so, and if they slept in too much, I guess they had to go hungry that day, so they could learn. But they were told on the sixth day, gather 2 days' worth, because there won't be any tomorrow, and it will keep over fine. And so some didn't want to believe that and said that, well, I tried that once and it was smelly. I don't want to go through that again. So they got up on the morning of the Sabbath to go, and there wasn't any. And God said, why do you refuse to obey my laws? And one thing we should notice about this is that this is Exodus 16, which is before Exodus 20, when they're at Mount Sinai and they give the Ten Commandments. Because some will try to argue, well, the Sabbath was just for the Jews given at Mount Sinai. Well, here the Sabbath was already in place before they ever reached Mount Sinai. And we see God, taking it seriously, and he even used a miracle to designate which day was the Sabbath, in that there was no manna that day, and the manna gathered the day before kept when the rest of the time it didn't. Let's go down to Numbers chapter 15. Numbers chapter 15, and we'll begin with verse 32. Numbers 15, beginning with verse 32. And while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him unto Moses and Aaron and unto the congregation. And they put him in ward, because it was not declared what should be done to him. And the Lord said unto Moses, the man shall be surely put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. And all the congregation brought him without the camp, and they stoned him with stones, and he died as the Lord commanded Moses. So did God take the Sabbath seriously? Just as much as any other part of his law. He did, so that, they already had the example of manna for a number of years. It was very clear which days were the Sabbath and what they were to do. They weren't to go out gathering firewood and stuff on the Sabbath day. And yet an individual blatantly did that in the sight of everyone. And so they went, well, what do we do with him? And God said, you stone him to death. So again, it just shows that God takes the Sabbath as a serious issue here. Let's go now to Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13. And we'll begin with verse 15. In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves, and lading asses, and as also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. There dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath day unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and said unto them, what evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers thus, and did not our God bring all this evil upon us and upon this city? Yet ye bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. It came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath, as some of the servants said I at the gates, and there should be no burden brought in on the Sabbath day. So the merchants and sellers of all kinds of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. Then I testified against them, and said, why lodge ye about the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands upon you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites they should cleanse themselves, that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. So, okay, when did Nehemiah live? After the Babylonian captivity. Remember, the children of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, they've been taken captive into Babylon for 70 years. Then they've been allowed to return to rebuild Jerusalem, and eventually to rebuild the temple, and so on was going to happen. And Nehemiah had come and was in charge of things, and he noticed that they were doing business on the Sabbath. They were bringing food and wares. They were having a street sale, a flea market. That's how they had markets back then. There were certain market days, and they'd all come set up stalls, and everyone go buy everything. So they were coming to sell food and things in Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And so he said, well, shut the gates. And it wasn't just, it's interesting here, we notice it wasn't just that the Jewish people were selling, but there were people from Tyre, Gentiles, who can keep the Sabbath anyway, who were selling. And yet, for both of them, he's saying no. And I think this gives us another little indicator about the Sabbath. Some want to argue, saying, well, I don't work on the Sabbath, but, I have no problem going out and, shopping and stuff on the Sabbath, because I'm not working. And the other person isn't a Sabbath keeper anyway, so what difference does it make? But here, well, the men from Tyre weren't Sabbath keepers, but yet Nehemiah still said, no, doing business like this, the buying and the selling, wasn't appropriate for the Sabbath. And so I think that begins to give us some little bit of indicators of how we should treat the Sabbath. We don't want the church just to make a list for us of, here's 101 things not to do on the Sabbath, and here's 5 things you can do on the Sabbath. That was the Jewish answer. Because, see, you remember Nehemiah's here saying, what are you doing? Because that's what happened to us before. Because if you go back and you read in Jeremiah and Isaiah and so on, why did one of the reasons God allowed the Babylonian captivity is because they weren't keeping the Sabbath. And so he says, here, we've just gotten out of captivity, we're just rebuilding the city, and now you're going right back to the mess, what got us into this mess. And so the Jewish answer was then to start making listings. Okay, what does it mean to work on the Sabbath? Well, that's too generic. And so they come up with a list of things that were work. And so it came to the point that by you get to the New Testament times, by the time of Jesus, they had what's called a Sabbath day's journey. And there was a certain distance from your home. If you didn't travel, you went any further than that, then it was considered work. But if you put a lunch out there, that was an extension of your home. So you could double the distance. And you couldn't carry a handkerchief. That was bearing a burden. But if you pinned it to your clothes, it became a part of your clothing. And so you start to see how it led to legalism, because when you have a list can never cover everything. So then you start looking for loopholes. But what do we need to do? Do we need a list, or do we need principles that we can prayerfully apply in our lives? Now, the Bible gives some specific things, indeed, here. And I think when the Bible's specific, we need to look at those specifics. But then in other circumstances, we can look at the principles behind those and the purpose of the Sabbath here. In fact, let's look at, to find a little more about the purpose of the Sabbath, let's go to Ezekiel chapter 20. Ezekiel 20. And first we'll look at verse 12. Moreover, also I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. And then verse 20. And hallow my Sabbaths, and they shall be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. So the Sabbath was to be a sign of a relationship between a person and God, between a person and the Creator. That's what we see there in Revelation 14:7. To worship the Creator, there in the language of the fourth commandment. And so the Sabbath was originally established at the end of creation week as a memorial of creation. And so it points to our relationship with God. So Sabbaths were meant to be about a relationship with God. And God has created us as free moral beings with the ability to enter into a relationship freely with Him. So when we begin to think about that, okay, the purpose of the Sabbath then is about a relationship with God. So as I look at things that the Bible doesn't specifically mention, I can sit there and say, well, does this thing tend to enhance my relationship with God, or does it tend to distract from developing my relationship with God? And so work is one of those things that that we're called upon to lay that aside, and so basically the purpose of that is to have this period of time we can set all these things aside that distract us and keep us. Some things that are fine in and of themselves, but for 24 hours say, okay, my relationship with God is the primary important thing here. And so the time that I really began to appreciate that the most, I think, because sometimes when you grow up as a kid, the Sabbath can kind of seem like, well, when's sundown going to be? Because I want to go have some fun. And that's not my parents' fault, because they did a pretty good job of keeping us busy, going out on nature hikes and different things on Sabbaths. But still, reach a point as a kid where you sometimes feel like that. But then in college, the year I was a student missionary, and I was teaching several classes, and so you have papers to grade and lesson plans to do and stuff. And boy, I tell you, when Friday evening came, it didn't matter if the papers weren't all graded yet, or the lesson plans weren't finished for the next week yet, or whatever. It was Sabbath, and I could just put it away and didn't have to think about it. And boy, that was wonderful. And so I gained a new appreciation for that part of the Sabbath. And so, the things that, would tend to distract us. And, and this is another thing we need to come up with, is that, we won't all, so in a sense that we don't have a list as a church. But I think each one of us, an individual, as we prayerfully apply the principles, we come up with sort of a list in our own lives of what we feel is appropriate for us to do on the Sabbath. And one thing to note is that there are some issues where your answer and my answer may not be exactly the same. In other words, there may be something I'm not comfortable doing on the Sabbath. To me, it feels like a distraction, but yet you may feel okay with that. And that's okay, because we're not called to go around and be Sabbath police for everybody else either. And so, but the main thing is, am I prayerfully, truly trying to apply these things? I mean, and if we're truly seeking God's will, He's going to lead us to where we need to be on these things. But we need to make that the priority. And I should say something on work. Even the Bible has certain exceptions. If you own animals, they have to be taken care of. So you've got dairy cattle, you can't skip a day milking the cows. They have to be milked. And so as we extend that principle out, people need to be taken care of. And so we have hospitals and nursing homes. There are people that need to be taken care of there. And so as a church, we've understood, well, there are certain medical profession things that directly involve the care of people that sometimes, that Adventists need to do those jobs. And that doesn't mean that, if you work under something, if you have the ability to say, hey, I'll work on Sundays if you'll work on Saturdays, so you can go to church on Sunday, I can go, with one of your coworkers, that's a good thing. But, sometimes there are people that need, if the job needs to be done to take care of a person in those types of circumstances, that's an okay thing. The Bible principle applies in that area. But, generally, if we're just looking at how can we, make a living, how can we have fun or whatever, if we're focusing on, those aspects of things, then we're not focusing upon building our relationship with God. So one of the ways we do that is we come to church. We spend time with family, we spend time with friends, we can spend time out in nature, we can spend time in service to others. Jesus tells us it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And so the Sabbath is meant to be a time of building relationships with God and with His people. And so we need to focus and find those things and fill up our time with those things. We can get caught up in thinking about all things not to do, and we never spend time, that was sort of the Jewish answer. You sort of sit and do nothing because you're too afraid to do anything because you might break the Sabbath. Instead, to say, okay, what is there that I can do? What can I do to fill up the Sabbath, to make it full, to make it a delight? In fact, let's go to Isaiah chapter 58. Isaiah chapter 58, verses 13 and 14. Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14. If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. So God said, if we stop focusing on trying to entertain ourselves with our own things, that I want to have fun and so on, instead focus ourselves in delighting ourselves, Lord, then we are going to delight in the Lord, and we're going to find a blessing there that we won't find otherwise. God, back in Genesis, it tells us that God blessed the seventh day. He placed His blessing upon it. There's a special blessing God has given to us in the Sabbath that we cannot fully experience if we don't participate in the Sabbath the way God intended. When we start seeking after God, that's where the blessing is, and we will experience that in new depths. So we're called upon to turn away our foot from finding our own pleasure on the Sabbath. Does that mean if it's fun, it's wrong? No, but it's not about seeking fun for fun's sake. But there are things I find, going on a nature hike a very pleasurable thing, but it's not about I'm just going to have fun. But when we spend time in nature, even as marred as it is by sin, there still testifies to God's power and might, as our Creator. And so many things that we can, do there, and it, gets us out, and we're enjoying the fresh air, and so on. And it's good for us both physically and spiritually, and it's a wonderful thing. And so God wants us to delight in the Sabbath. He wants us to receive the blessing that He has for us in the Sabbath. But if, and so we need to have that experience now. Because if we're not truly entering into the Sabbath experience now, then when the test comes at the end of time, doesn't matter if you're going to church on Saturday now, you won't be going to church on Saturday then, if you don't have the relationship behind it. So the day of worship is only tied in with the relationship. If the relationship is lacking, you're not going to keep the day. And and so on. So that's why it's so important we move beyond just saying, okay, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, so I go to church on Saturday. Yeah, you go to church on Saturday, but what more do you do? We need to see the Sabbath as the blessing that God has for us to enter into that full Sabbath experience of relationship with Him, to discover what it truly means to be keeping the Sabbath. Then when we have that experience with Him, we're going to be ready to pass the final test of loyalty because we're in a relationship. The test just reveals what's already in our hearts. If our hearts aren't right, by that time, they're not going to get right instantaneously. Our characters are being formed day by day in the decisions that we make now. So now is the time to be studying. Now is the time to be settling into the truth. Now is the time to be truly coming in and if we're finding the Sabbath to be a burden. Last text I'm going to look at is 1 John chapter 5. 1 John chapter 5. Verses 2 and 3. By this we know that we love the children of God, and we love God and keep His commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not grievous. His commandments aren't grievous. They're not burdensome. So if I'm finding the Sabbath to be a burden, that should be a wake-up call to me that I need to look at my relationship with God. It's saying that there's something lacking there in my relationship with God. Because if I am in love with God, keeping all of His commandments, including the Sabbath commandment, are going to become a delight to me. Because I know those are pleasing in His sight, and I want to do the things that are pleasing in His sight because I love Him. When love is the motivating factor, which is what God has wanted from the beginning, then everything runs along smoothly. But if it doesn't, if I'm just doing it out of a sense of, well, I have to keep it so I can go to heaven, or I have to, if we're doing it grudgingly in this, there's a spiritual problem in our hearts. And so it can be a spiritual test for us right now, our attitude of, how we keep the Sabbath. Is it a day of spiritual delight, or is it a day of dread? It's like, oh, here comes the Sabbath again. When is it going to be over? And we need to honestly look at our hearts that way and say, do I need a deeper relationship with Jesus? Because ultimately it's all about Jesus. As we read in our scripture reading today, if you love me, keep my commandments. Love is the issue. And the Sabbath at the end is going to be ultimately a test of love. Who do you love? Who do you worship?